Tēnā koutou te whanau mana me nui kia koutou katoa. So, because in the Māori world, every educational kind of event is also engaged with the spiritual. It's still it's engaged with the spiritual, so you don't separate the educational and the spiritual. So because that's the way they operate and it's the way I operate, I'll start with a prayer. Yeah. Bīnui tātā, let us pray. E te atua te kaipakoro nā mea katoa. Whakapainga e kōrero i te mo te papa me te tama e koeru topu. Amen. So, So when Debbie asked me to engage with the seminar group and do something, well, dance really isn't my forte. So I wish I could tell you about Māori dance and kapa haka and stuff like that, but actually I did do a kapa haka paper at the university I taught at, and it nearly killed me. And yes.
Singing and actions at the same time.
It's singing and actions. I could sing and I could do the actions, but when I tried to do them together, and at one point they decided to learn a new song and dance 2 weeks out from the final assessment, which was a performance. And one of the tutors figured out that this was not going to work for me. And at that point, I was right in the front row of the concert party. And so she said, now Stephen, when we finish the second to last song, I want you to move right to the back and to the middle and stand behind Jacob. And Jacob was huge. So at that point, nobody saw anything that I did for the final song, which was just as well, because I was all over the place. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about the connection between New Zealand's founding document, New Zealand's kind of Magna Carta, and Christianity, because there was a very strong connection and a Christian influence on this particular treaty. And what you see there is actually the treaty, and it looks a bit manky because it was stored improperly in the bottom of the basement of the National Library of New Zealand. It got water damage and the rats got at it, which is why it's got all these sort of edges. So the answer is, for a long time, the Treaty of Waitangi, both physically and in the culture of New Zealand, was ignored and neglected. That's the history. So next slide, thanks. So this is a picture of Waitangi in February this year, when we celebrate Te Tiriti, the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So you can see the waka, the canoe, all drawn up. The canoe crews doing a haka on the beach there, and the tourists and visitors all there. So Waitangi, physically, that place, which is north of Auckland, about 2.5 hours drive north of Auckland, was the kind of cradle of settler activity in New Zealand in the early days, 1800s to 1840s. And when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, there were about 2,000 European settlers in New Zealand and about 110 to 120,000 Māori. So Pākehā, what we call Pākehā settlers, were definitely in the minority. And so in my family, we are descended from a Pākehā settler. His name was William Swanson. And he came to New Zealand in about 1845. He was a shipbuilder by trade. And he married a Maori woman. Her name was Anirangi Tūnoa. And she was descended from the Romafokata tribe. So that's where our family connection is. So we have a kind of a foot in the settler camp and a foot in the Maori camp. And the word Maori is an interesting word because it's the way Maori used to describe themselves when the settlers arrived. And before then, they didn't need to describe themselves that way because they were identified by tribe. Māori people don't say to each other, oh, you're Māori. They say, what tribe do you belong to? And so I'm Ronga Whakaata, and that's my tribe. Ngāti Kaipoho is the sub-tribe. Manatuki is the marae. So the settlers arrived and said to Māori people, who are we? And they said to them, well, you're tangata Pākehā, which isn't a derogatory term, it's just a description. You're these other people. And then they said, well, who are you? And I think with a twinkle in their eye, they said, oh, we're tangata Māori, because Māori is ordinary. So wai Māori is tap water, all right? So we're ordinary people and you're these other people. So this is Waitangi, and it is really the cradle of the New Zealand nation. Next slide. And this is the place where Samuel Marsden landed from Sydney. And he preached the gospel at this place at Uihi in 1814. Now Samuel Marsden was a bit of an interesting character as churchmen go. He was known in Sydney as the flogging parson because he was a chaplain to the prison settlement there, and he was a fairly brutal guy from all accounts. So it's interesting, isn't it, how God uses people that we don't expect. But he landed at Waitangi, and that became the place where you had the first contact of the gospel with the indigenous people there. Next slide. And so Samuel Marsden preached this first sermon at Waitangi on Christmas Day in 1814. And this was, in a sense, the starting point of the gospel in Aotearoa New Zealand. And it's actually a little bit hard to figure out how it came across to Māori people there because he had a translator. And according to the local stories of that translation, some things got a little bit morphed. So actually what the people heard and what Samuel Marsden said is not all that clear, and we'll just sort of draw a bit of a veil over that one, I think. Next slide. Yeah, but Christianity definitely made an impact in those early days in New Zealand. So the gospel message came to New Zealand by 1838, which was before the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. The missionaries had been active for about 20 years. And the Bible, the complete Bible, was translated into Te Reo Māori before the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. So there was a strong influence on Māori people in relation to the Bible, because wherever the missionaries went, they taught Māori to read and to write, and the text they used was the Bible. And this was one of the few things that was available in Te Reo Māori. And the missionaries obviously were heavily involved in that translation. Next slide, thanks. So we come to the Treaty of Waitangi itself. Now, the treaty was signed in 1840, and the reason for the treaty was that in general, the British colonial empire had a pretty poor track record of dealing with indigenous people. And that's a little bit of an understatement. And so there was an impulse in the British government at the time that maybe New Zealand could be different. That there was a possibility, at least, that New Zealand could be different. Next slide. So this is Lord Glenelg, and at the time that the treaty was being drafted, he was the secretary for the colonies in the British government in London. Next slide. And he had a colleague who was Sir James Stephen, who was the permanent Under-Secretary for the Colonies Department. And both of these people were evangelical Christians. Next slide. So these two people were determined that New Zealand would be different in terms of the way it was treated from the British colonial kind of view. And they also had close links with the Anglican Church Missionary Society, CMS. And to this day, the Anglican Church in New Zealand in Maori is called Hahi Mihinari, the Missionary Church. That's what it's called. So I am an Anglican priest, so I'm a Minita Mihinari. That's my title. So that CMS have been very active in sending missionaries to New Zealand right from the start of Christian contact. So these two guys were committed to seeing Maori interests protected in the proposed colonisation of New Zealand. And initially, they proposed, as part of their government policy, that Maori would be an independent nation. New Zealand would be an independent nation. Maori would be the sole governing people. That's how radical that was. But with the arrival of the New Zealand company, who basically were a pack of scammers and scoundrels, they realised that actually they couldn't hold back the whole settlement thing. So, next slide, thanks. So what happened was, they tried to establish British law as a restraint on the colonists who were already here and the companies that were kind of land grabbing when they arrived. And their influence resulted in this guy, Lieutenant Governor Captain William Hobson, being dispatched to New Zealand with instruction to seek Crown sovereignty of New Zealand on the basis of what was called free and intelligent consent of Maori, and to ensure that their land rights and their political rights were protected. And James Stephen, who we've seen before, drafted the instructions which were given to William Hobson as he came out to New Zealand in 1840. And I'm just going to read these instructions to you because it's quite a long passage, so putting it on the screen doesn't make a lot of sense. All dealings with the Aborigines or their lands must be conducted on the same principle of sincerity, justice, and good faith as must govern your transactions with them for the recognition of Her Majesty's sovereignty in the islands. Nor is this all. They must not be permitted to enter into any contracts in which they might be ignorant and unintentional authors of injuries to themselves. You will not, for example, purchase from them any territory, the retention of which by them would be essential or highly conducive to their own comfort, safety, or subsistence. The acquisition of land by the Crown for the future settlement of British subjects must be confined to such districts as the natives can alienate without distress or serious inconvenience to themselves. To secure the observance of this rule will be one of the first duties of you as their official protector. So the instruction from James Stephens and Lord Connell was very clear that the Maori people in New Zealand were not to be ripped off in terms of land or anything else. And Maori saw and still see the treaty in spiritual and Christian terms. Next slide. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, is often called by Māori Te Kawenata o Waitangi. And Kawenata is the Māori transliteration of the word covenant. All right. So Māori had had missionaries there for over 20 years. They'd been reading the Bible for 20 years. They understood the concept of covenant. And they applied this term covenant to this treaty. That's how they viewed it. So when Captain Hobson arrived in New Zealand in January 1840, the task of negotiating this treaty was actually beyond him. Because for one, he couldn't read, write or speak Māori. So he relied on the missionaries who were currently there, who were fluent, to actually be the translators, both in terms of the written document and the spoken negotiation. And the other thing about this was that the Māori, the missionaries who had come to the Māori, particularly some of the missionaries in Waitangi, around Waitangi in Northland, they were trusted people. Next slide. So this is the Reverend Henry Williams. He was a CMS missionary who came out to New Zealand, and he was an ex-Royal Navy officer. So he was experienced in naval warfare. He fought in the Battle of Trafalgar. He was on the ships when they were bashing the daylights out of each other. So he had had experience of war and conflict. And he developed a really strong reputation in Northland, in this area, which was the primarily Ngāpuhi country, that's the tribe there, as a peacemaker. And quite often, he would actually get between two warring parties with his Bible and negotiate a peace between them. And the nickname, because he wore glasses, the nickname among the Māori people in that area for him was Karuwha, which means four. So, he was present at the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and he was the major person in terms of drafting the Te Reo Māori version of the Treaty of Waitangi, in terms of translating it from English into Te Reo Māori. Next slide, please. So as I said before, Tiriti o Waitangi, Te Kawenata o Waitangi. Next slide. So we come to the treaty signing. In a way, I think it's a bit of a pity that his brother William Williams wasn't there as well, because William Williams was a better speaker and writer of Te Reo Māori. He was more fluent than Henry Williams. But it was a question of who was there at the time. The treaty was drafted and signed in a hurry. It was basically done overnight. Hobson arrived. They drafted this little one-pager, which has 3 articles in it. It's really simple. Henry Williams sat down with his son that night, translated it into Reo Māori. The next day, they had the meeting with the chiefs. So it was all done in a screaming hurry. And without Williams' efforts at the signing, it's probable the treaty wouldn't have been signed, because he could explain the treaty to the assembled Māori chiefs, and they debated about whether they should sign it or not, and he translated it into Te Reo Māori. Now famously, if you know anything about the Tiriti, you'll know that there's differences between the Māori version and the English version that have become quite controversial. But in international law, what happens is, if there is a treaty which has an indigenous language version and an English language version, and there's differences, then the preferred version, the version that has the most legal weight, is the indigenous language version. Okay, so that's why it's Te Tiriti that's the actual treaty signed. Next slide, please. So, The debate, well, the spread of Christianity had been initially slow, but by the 1830s, which is 10 years before the treaty, the gospel was surging across New Zealand. Regular Maori attendance at Anglican church services alone was recorded at around 30,000 people on a Sunday. And remember, this is a time when that represents about a quarter of the Maori population in New Zealand. And the Wesleyans also experienced major growth. As Michael King notes in his Penguin History of New Zealand, Te Atua, the God of the Bible, was on the move. Next slide, thanks. So Captain Hobson arrived, and Maori were predisposed to the offer that he carried. They'd seen the benefits of Christianity, peace between tribes. Maori society has a principle called utu, which means reciprocity. So if you do something good for me, I'm obliged to do something good for you. If you do something bad to me, I'm obliged to do something bad to you. And so utu had sort of fostered sort of tit-for-tat warfare among Maori tribes for centuries. And really what happened was the peacemaking sort of influence of Christianity had done something to sort of dampen that down. So there was less intertribal warfare. And many chiefs understood this biblical covenant idea to be part of this whole Christian framework. Next slide. Yep, next one after that. Okay, I've got to set that. There we go. So, unfortunately, as we know, the treaty was then dishonored. Successive governors, including Governor Grad, did things like issue edicts to Maori. When they didn't obey the edicts to withdraw from the land, for example, in the Waikato, he invaded. That Waikato is where I currently live. Raupatu followed, which is confiscation. After the war, Maori were defeated. They were basically pushed out into the hinterland, into what's called the King Country. And so about 2 million acres were confiscated from Maori, converted into settler farmland. Recently, the Treaty of Waitangi tribunals have been reversing those kinds of decisions, but be aware that where you get, for example, in the Waikato, a Treaty of Waitangi settlement that involves compensation. In the case of the Waikato, the final settlement amount that's been returned to the tribe is about 2% of the actual value of the land that was taken. But now, Tainui Group Holdings, that's the business arm of the Tainui tribe, they are currently worth something in the region of $6 billion. So now Maori economy is a real key player in New Zealand. But the treaty was dishonoured, and recently, if you've been following the news, how are we going, Deb? Okay. You'll have been following the raru, which means the controversy, around the Treaty Principles Bill, proposed by our very own dear David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party. And this bill was an attempt to rewrite Te Tiriti o Waitangi as a kind of modern Bill of Rights. So rather than being a contract between the Crown and Maori people, it was an attempt to sort of morph it into a sort of a James Locke style Bill of Rights. And it got a lot of pushback. Deb and I went on the protest in Hamilton that was attended by thousands of people. 30,000 people turned up outside Parliament to protest that bill. And last week, it got voted down by the House. 112 to 11. There were 300,000 submissions on the bill, and it's the most submissions that's ever been for any bill in New Zealand, Pākehā and Māori, and it broke the parliamentary reporting system. They couldn't actually process all the submissions. So yeah, so it's still very much a live item, and you'll often hear Māori people say things like "Toitu te Tiriti," honour the treaty. And the other interesting thing is that the Christian church also in this last little while has rediscovered its voice in relation to the treaty. So there was active participation by Christians, by churches in the submissions, in the protests. We rediscovered our voice. And I think that that's an important lesson for us as well, because Christians were present at the formation of the treaty and then gradually faded into silence. And silence, of course, is always the support of the oppressor. That's how it works. Last one. Yeah. So that's a Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal meeting. The Waitangi Tribunal was set up to adjudicate these kinds of issues, and it's still going. So we're still in the process of trying to put right some of the things that historically have been wrong. Next slide. So for us today, what does this mean for us today? Is this just sort of interesting, dusty history? Or what does it mean? I think we've got to rediscover the intersection between church and politics in a way that the church can advocate for the poor and the powerless and for justice. We've got to acknowledge and keep acknowledging, I think, that Christianity is woven into the fabric of New Zealand. It was present there in our founding document, and recent research by a university scholar, Dr. Julia Chevalier-Watts from the University of Waikato, where I was a teacher. She's an avowed atheist, by the way. She's found that Christian churches and charities in New Zealand, things like food banks, community support, emergency accommodation, contribute $6.1 billion equivalent value to the economy of New Zealand in 2024. So the New Zealand Christian churches' contribution to the community of New Zealand is about the same in GDP terms as our wine industry. About the same. So I think one of the things I've always had a bit of a grizzle about with my secular colleagues at the university is their dismissal of the Christian contribution to our country. So both from a point of view from history as well as the contribution the churches are still making today, the church is important. And in fact, the article about this lady who did this research says the government should consider ways to empower churches to do more. And she started out from the exactly reverse position. She was all for shutting down the charitable status of churches. And through her research, she came to the opposite conclusion. So I think going forward, we've got two burdens. I think for Pākehā people, settler people, descendants of the original settlers, the Crown who made that original contract in Te Tiriti, our burden is justice. We must, as far as we can, right the wrongs of the past. We won't always be able to right them, but as far as we can, that's the burden. For Māori people, and because I have a foot in both camps, I can speak on both sides, it's very handy. I think there is a burden of forgiveness. I think that for Māori people, moving on is the key. And you get people like the Tainui people who have accepted the settlement of the Treaty of Waitangi and made a really positive contribution both economically and in other ways to the Waikato region here and today. The burden of forgiveness, not holding on to bitterness, moving on is part of what we need to do. And so I'll just just to finish with a karakia whakamutunga, a closing prayer. E te atua te kai whakaora nā mea te tau. Whakapainga I nei koe. Whakamoimiti ana ki ēnei tāngata. Waka whakaro, me oku waihu. Me te ngō te papa, me te mitama, me te wairu,